Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a particular form of religious belief and genre of religious writing called apocalyptic or apocalypticism. And often when we talk about the end of the world or something you feel like something happens and it feels like the end of the world, and we say, "Oh, it's apocalyptic." That goes back to a certain understanding of the way the world works. That's a particularly religious framework. And we're bringing it in here because partly because it's important, because apocalyptic is still very much a part of religiosity, especially within Christianity and Islam. But in particular, I think it's very important for understanding some of the religious dimensions of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And so you're going to be bringing that together with Socrates as you're reading King's letter for your essay this week. So let's talk about apocalypse. And you might remember that 2012 was supposed to be the Mayan apocalypse. And of course, it turned out it's not an apocalypse at all. And this is true in two ways. First of all, and here I'm referring to Apolinario Chile Pishtun, who's a Mayan priest, Mayan elder. And as he points out in an article, an interview with him in 2009, he says, this apocalyptic ideas aren't even Mayan ideas, they're Western ideas. And in the second place, so it's a sort of apocalyptic is a sort of Western European, Mediterranean way of thinking about things, and not the sort of ancient Mayan way of thinking about things. And so, if it's both about the end of the world, then what's not apocalyptic about the end of the Mayan calendar? And of course, that's the second part, which is that it wasn't in the Mayan calendar the end of the world. It was the end of a particular understanding of, or a particular set of calculations into the future called the long count. And that's all, it just was then going to start again. That was it. That was the end of it. But people sort of took this seriously in a kind of spiritual or mystical way. And we might wonder also why it is that things like the Mayan apocalypse, even for people who aren't Mayan, appeals as a kind of way of understanding something that's happening in the world. Why was that popular? Why were there movies about the end of the world in 2012? And why were there articles written about the end of the world in 2012? And some of you may even still remember the year 2000. People thought that there was going to be catastrophe. And of course, there wasn't. Not even all of our computer systems went down. So there's something about the Mayan apocalypse, the end of the long count in 2012, that taps into a sort of general appeal of this idea of apocalyptic. And we might want, over the course of this lecture, to keep in our heads, what is it about this way of thinking that's appealing today, not just, say, 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, but now. Western religious traditions are uniquely apocalyptic in the world. That is to say, the Abrahamic faiths, the three religions, all of which trace themselves back to the biblical figure Abraham, and that is to say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace themselves back to Abraham. So if you go back and look at the stories from about Genesis 12 up through the mid-20s, I think it is, the sacrifice of Isaac almost is in Genesis 22. All of those traditions trace themselves back to Abraham. Abraham has a covenant with God, that then he has his son Isaac and the great nation, which would become the Jewish nation. And then, of course, St. Paul in the New Testament says that Abraham is the first person to be justified by faith, to be reckoned righteous by faith. And so in a really important way, he's the first Christian, and Christians are heirs to the promise of God's promise to Abraham by adoption through Christ. And then in the Muslim tradition, Abraham is the first to submit to God. He is the first to be Muslim. To be Muslim is to be one who submits, or one who surrenders their will to God. And Abraham is the first to do this. And then his first son Ishmael then becomes the sort of forebear of Muslims. So all three of those traditions go back to Abraham. And all three of those traditions have significant apocalyptic strains to them. And it's something you see almost nowhere else. I do mention two other traditions here. Early Taoists in China, back in the 2nd century, the 3rd century, imagine an apocalyptic event that will usher in an era that would be called the Great Peace. And even today, there are Buddhists who understand the future Buddha Maitreya as someone who is still to come and bring a new Dharma, a new Buddha teaching of enlightenment for the world. But those are kind of outliers outside of these Western Abrahamic traditions. So there's something, this when Apollinario Pashtun says these are Western ideas, this is what he means. That they go back to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and not to other, even less sort of indigenous Mayan traditions in South America. We can talk about two modes in the biblical text in particular, especially if we look at the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. There's an apocalyptic sense, which we see really played out in the New Testament, an apocalyptic sense that things are going to happen to us, and that's part of God's plan. It's the direction that the universe is headed. And then there's a prophetic mode, which says that we've done things to deserve bad things to happen. And what prophets do is come and say, you're doing the wrong things. And if you don't start doing the right things, there's going to be disaster. And so there's this prophetic mode that seems to be a response to human action. And there's an apocalyptic mode that seems to be where history has been headed from the very beginning. And so apocalyptic takes this sort of catastrophic destruction of the world as part of the overall process that God planned for the world from the beginning. So we want to distinguish an apocalyptic mode that says this is where history is going from a prophetic mode that says that these catastrophic events are divine responses to particular things that we do. So the idea that Hurricane Katrina was a response to immorality in New Orleans is prophetic. But the idea that God has planned for Christ to return at a certain time and judge everyone, that's apocalyptic. Okay? So apocalyptic in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, can really be located in the book of Daniel. And the whole of the Jewish Bible, what I'm calling the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, is written in the Hebrew language, except for some components of Daniel, a little bit of which is in Aramaic. But it's in Daniel, which is a late book from probably the 3rd century BC. And it's the first time we get these sort of visionary prophecies. So the word apocalypse itself just means revelation. And the image is of curtains being opened up, and you can see what's hidden behind the curtains. And so in apocalyptic visions, often what happens is that someone looks into the sky, the visionary looks into the sky, and the skies are parted. And then the visionary can see through to whatever it is that God is showing him or her. And so in the book of Daniel, we get this sort of very characteristic apocalyptic passage from the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. So Daniel here is speaking, and he says, "Then I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left of its feet." This is what he said. So the person who is speaking, who's delivering the message to Daniel. "As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it into pieces." And so this is sort of classic apocalyptic in the sense that we have this sort of terrifying beast who seems to be some combination of artificial pieces and perhaps natural pieces. So there's iron and bronze, so things that would have to be crafted. It hasn't sprung up from the earth. So there's something artificial about it. And then, of course, what it does is destroy things. And in this case, that image of that destroying beast is connected to a time in the future, there shall be, when a particular kingdom will be conquering all of the earth. And so the image of this terrifying beast is then understood to point forwards to a kingdom which will be doing the things that the beast is said to do, destroying the earth, trampling the earth, and breaking it into pieces. So this basic idea comes forth comes forward into the New Testament, written in Greek. And here we have from the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 24, we have a similar sort of idea about, or expression of ideas, apocalyptic ideas. When Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Because, of course, when Jesus comes back, that will be the end of the age and things will change. Jesus answered them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Now, there are a lot of interesting things in this passage, but I want you to take note of several particular things. First, notice that Jesus' return, which will mark the end of the age, the end of this age of the world. And so the implication then is that there will be another age to come. And so at the end of this passage, Jesus says, this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. And of course, the birth pangs are the pains of childbearing. And so he's saying that all of these horrible things, the suffering, is but the process of giving birth to a new age, giving birth to a new world. So here we have signaled the idea that the end of the one age in apocalyptic thinking is all about bringing into existence a new age, a new world. Notice also he says that there will be signs. And so you're going to hear about all of these things, but the time will be after those things come. So wars, nation rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, but also notice, so there's social strife, political strife, but there's also a kind of strife in the natural world. So famines, the earth won't be growing food, nothing will grow, and so people will be starving. And the earth itself, nation will rise against nation, and tectonic plate will rise against tectonic plate, right? The very physical world will be in conflict with itself when the earth is coming. Or, sorry, when the new age is coming. And then finally, one of the classic Christian apocalyptic statements, the book of Revelation, the very last book in the New Testament, the very last book in the Christian Bible. And so there are 7 seals, as you may know, famously. And here's a description of what happens when the visionary sees the opening of the 6th seal. There came a great earthquake. So notice the earth itself is starting to fall apart. This is what the earthquake is. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. That is to say, by a windstorm. So, like when a windstorm shakes the tree and the fruit falls. The sky vanished like a scroll, rolling itself up. And every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" So the beginning, you see, is sort of similar to what we've seen in the previous 2 slides. There's all of this structural conflict. Social conflict and also conflict within the natural world. The natural world seems to be in conflict with itself, tearing itself apart. But even then, right, these images of the sky vanishing like a scroll rolling up, and the mountains and the islands being moved from where they are. There's a sort of general disorder coming. right? It's from the order of creation, we get the disorder of the destruction, the disorder of the end. And then here come not just um, the slaves, but also the powerful, also the rich, also the wealthy, all of the people who think they are untouchable, and they're all running to the mountains. And not only that, you think they're hiding, and we know that the mountains are falling down and there are earthquakes, and yet they're hiding in the mountains. Well, that's what you would do if what you really want is for them to destroy you. And so here they are crying to the mountains to fall on them and destroy them so that they won't have to face the judgment that's to come. So something then about this transition is going to involve a divine judgment on the way that the world is and the way people have been. This is going to be part of this sort of catastrophic end of the world. So somehow all of this destruction is connected to justice and injustice, which at this point shouldn't surprise you, given the direction we've been heading in the class, I hope. And here we'll look at an example from Islam. So we had one book from the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible. We had a couple of passages from the New Testament, the Christian text. And here we're going to look at a fantastic surah of the Quran, Surah 81. And a little bit later in the course, we're going to spend some time on Islam, and you'll get a better sense of how Islam is structured and how Islamic belief is structured. But one of the important things to recognize is that Muhammad, in the 7th century, in the Arabian Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is now, was an apocalyptic prophet before he ruled over essentially a small kingdom. And when he first showed up, much of what he was doing was preaching to people that God was going to judge them when the world ended. And so you're going to see this later when we look at Surah 81, that is very much about injustice. But here we get a fantastic example of what happens in apocalyptic visions. When the sun is overturned, when the stars fall away, and this sounds just like Revelation, right? When the sun is overturned, it's thrown down like knocking over a glass, for example, and it falls off the table. When the sun is overturned, when the stars fall out of the sky, when the mountains are moved, and the seas are boiled, when the pages are folded out, and the sky is flayed open. So the pages of what? The pages of the Book of Judgment. And notice the violence of what's happening here. The sky being flayed like an animal that's about to be prepared to be eaten. The sky will be flayed open. So what happens is that we go from an orderly creation, which has been headed in a general direction of chaos, because into this just world was introduced injustice. And of course, injustice is chaotic. And so essentially what happens at the end is that the chaos of injustice becomes the very structure of the world. That is to say, the world itself becomes chaotic. And it is unmade, right? So instead of the sun being put in the sky, it falls out of the sky. It's thrown over. Instead of the stars being put in the sky and moving so that we can keep track of the seasons, they fall out of the sky. Everything now becomes the same. Instead of the mountains standing tall where they always are, they move away, right? And then of course the sky gets cut open and it's flayed open, and what's going to come out but God? So let's think about what's at stake with an apocalyptic worldview. The starting point for an apocalyptic worldview is that there's something wrong with the world, right? This is at the heart of apocalyptic, and I think this is one of the reasons why apocalyptic in religious and non-religious forms is still so appealing. That we really do think that the way things should be is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So if you do good things, good happen to you, right? Good happens to you. It's the idea of good karma, as we understand it in the West in particular. And if you do bad things, then bad things should happen to you in some sense. There should be some response, some punishment of some kind. But if you're good, you should get better. You should get good things. But in fact, what we find around us is that pretty consistently, there are good people who have bad things happen to them. People work hard and can't make enough money, right? People treat other people nicely and are treated badly by them. Conversely, good things happen to bad people. So we know all these kinds of people who treat other people like crap, and up they go up the corporate ladder, right? And they make lots of money, or they get to be famous, or whatever it is. And so the world in this sense seems to be topsy-turvy. It's upside down. Instead of good things happening to good people, bad things happen to good people. Instead of bad things happening to bad people, good things happen to bad people. So there's the way the world should be and the way we in fact see the world. And we're trying to figure not only why that is, but, well, we're figuring how it's going to be different. And notice, by the way, that usually the good people are us, whoever us is, right? In this case, you and me, you and I are us. And the bad people are the rich and the powerful, typically. And I think this is one of the appeals of apocalyptic, is that it's going to just like the poor people were hiding in the mountains, ones who had been bad, perhaps. So were the rich. They were out there. Apocalyptic is totally leveling in this respect. Everybody is the same. So here's where the teleology comes in. I said before that one of the differences between an apocalyptic worldview and a prophetic worldview is that in the prophetic worldview, we do something bad and God comes and says, stop doing that, or there's going to be punishment. The apocalyptic worldview says that history has a purpose, a telos. It has a goal. And that's what we mean by teleological. That is to say, it's goal-directed, right? There's a purpose in time. And that history is out of our hands. We can't do anything about it. And so one of the reasons that apocalyptic arises in powerless communities is that they don't have the power to change their situations. And so it's not surprising if then the idea that God will, in fact, take care of the injustice in the world makes a lot of sense in that context. So where's history going? So we're saying that we've recognized that there's something wrong about the world. Instead of good things happening to good people, bad things happen to good people, and vice versa. So we live in an unjust age, an evil age, an age where the bad can oppress the good, the wicked can oppress the just or the righteous. And we've said that apocalyptic has a teleological view of time, a teleological view of history. And so, of course, where do we think God is going to send history? He's not going to send she is not going to send, certainly in this case, in Christianity, we would talk about he. God sends history not towards injustice, but towards justice. And so the idea in apocalyptic is that we currently live in this just age, but the age that's coming, the age that is promised by apocalyptic, is the just age, the good age, the age of freedom from oppression, right? The age where the good people get good things. And so this is what we mean by apocalyptic dualism. So the idea of dualism is that you separate your understanding of the world into two things. There's this and there's that. There are different kinds of dualism, but here we're talking about a kind of moral dualism. There are the good guys and the bad guys. And we're also talking about a kind of chronological dualism. There's the age of the bad guys and there's the coming age of the good guys, right? So there's a division in time. And now we are in the one, but we are headed towards the next one. That's what apocalyptic promises. So here's the question, right? If that's where we're headed, how is it that we get there? And of course, the way we get from the unjust age to the just age is God intervenes in history. So God has been letting history do its thing, but then the time comes, and through catastrophic intervention, the disruption of the social order, disruption of the natural order, the world is prepared to be remade. And in particularly in the Jewish and Christian traditions, but there's even a version of this in the Muslim tradition, a messianic, the idea of a Messiah who comes. And the Messiah is going to be the one who ushers out the old world and ushers in the new world. Even in Islam, there's the idea of the Mahdi. But in Judaism, we can talk about Bar Kokhba is the name of a particular man who was identified as the Messiah in an early revolt after Jesus, and he fought a war against the Romans, and they failed. And then, of course, Jesus is understood as a Messiah by Christians, but he's a very different kind of Messiah, because the Jewish Messiah is going to be the one who leads the Jewish people in a war to overthrow the oppression of the Romans and reestablish the proper worship of God in God's land. And so Messiah, the word Messiah literally means the one who is anointed, the anointed one. And in the Jewish tradition, it's the king who is anointed. And so the Messiah is the king. And of course, Christianity changes this, and we're going to look at the differences between Jewish and Christian apocalyptic here in a moment. But in any case, the result of divine intervention is judgment, so that the good people are recognized as good, just people are recognized as just, and the unjust or the wicked are recognized as wicked. And in most understandings of this, then there's some kind of punishment or reward. And then once that's taken care of, God institutes a new just world. And there's a fabulous picture of this at the end of the book of Revelation. And so contemporary Christians often understand the goal of Christianity as to be out there in heaven somewhere with God. But in the New Testament, at least in the book of Revelation, the end does not mean going away from this world. It means a transformation of the earth we live on. And this is very clear here in chapter 21 of Revelation, at the very end of the New Testament. And the visionary sees a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth, that is to say the unjust ones, right, had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem. So the old Jerusalem is gone. And now we have a new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. So notice that the old Jerusalem's wiped away to make space for the new Jerusalem. We don't go out to it. That is to say, human beings don't go out to the new Jerusalem. The new Jerusalem comes down to earth, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And this is interesting too, because here human beings are the husband and Jerusalem is the bride. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, so this is God, of course, saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals." And so it's like the temple in ancient Judaism. And the temple was the home of God until the temple was destroyed. The home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. And the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And so here we have a new creation after the elimination of the old one. And this new one is a paradise. It's the end of death. There won't be any more dying, no more mourning, no more sadness, no more suffering. Right? In the new just age, there will be no cause for suffering. And God will have wiped tears from everyone's eyes. It's a compelling vision in the sense that it's hard to imagine anyone wouldn't want the end of suffering. So how are we going to get there? God is going to take us there. When is that going to happen? Well, many people have wondered and tried to calculate the end of the world. In fact, just in 2012, early 2013, there was a Christian preacher in the U.S. I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but he made one prediction that was in the fall and the world didn't end. And then he made another prediction that he said, I miscalculated. It'll be in the spring, and then of course, we're still here. But this is what people do: is they look to the Bible. What Christians do is look to the Bible and try to figure out the assumptions that there's a kind of math that in the Bible, the message of the end of the world and the coming age is in there. And we just have to figure out how to understand it. And one of the most famous American apocalypticists is this guy, William Miller, who predicted the end of the world in 1844. And he had a whole bunch of math based on calculations, biblical calculations, that are historical calculations. And so you can see this is a kind of a flyer that Miller had put together, where he explains his reading of history. And you see all those numbers are dates from the ancient world and Babylon through Rome. And there you've got the many-headed beast. And then there's papal, because of course the papacy is evil. Mohammedans, just under the lion, are Muslims, of course. And so he comes to the conclusion that the world is going to end. It doesn't. And people adapt and adjust. And the American Christian group known as Seventh-day Adventists are it's the group that survived after Miller's prophecy turned out not to be, or Miller's reading of biblical predictions turned out to be mistaken. But this is what people do. People try to calculate when the end will come, because it's presumed that if it's God's plan, this is the part that makes it distinct from what I'm calling prophecy, right? So this stuff is predictive. Prophetic is about delivering a moral message and saying you're going to be punished for something that you're doing. Apocalyptic is about how this has always been God's plan. And so if God's revelation is in the Bible, then we can read the Bible and discern God's plan in the Bible, because it has always been what it's going to be. It does not respond to us. It has always been what it's going to be. And so we can look at it and we can map it out. And people have often tried to do this. And so far, of course, there is as yet there is no end. And so people are still trying to figure it out, even today. So what about 2012? Well, of course, it's not apocalyptic because it's a misunderstanding of the calendar. But I've got zombies on here because zombies are precisely sort of in this apocalyptic mode, except not, of course. Because, so there's something, we all joke about the zombie apocalypse. There's stuff on Facebook where you can find out who your companions will be when the zombie apocalypse comes. There are jokes about, getting your zombie apocalypse training together. But we're using the term apocalypse there just a little bit loosely. Because the zombies often, if you think about all the zombie movies typically what happens is, so think Resident Evil, for example. Often the zombies are a result of human hubris. That is to say, it's some scientific experiment gone wrong. We've got some plan to make super soldiers. They turn into zombies. There's some scientific research, and there's a virus, and people turn into zombies. And so, in fact, it's catastrophic. But it's not apocalyptic, because it's not part of an overall historical plan. Instead, in fact, it's prophecy, right? In the sense that we are being punished we produce the zombies who punish us for our own arrogance, right? And yet, there's something about this notion that the world has to be cleansed because there's something fundamentally wrong with us and the way we're running the world. And apocalyptic taps into that. And the zombie apocalypses all tap into that sort of general fear that we can't control ourselves anymore, and that the world is sort of getting out of our hands. So let's think about the word apocalyptic as a term quickly. Just notice that I'm distinguishing between apocalyptic genre. So here, a genre is a category. So we can talk about a genre of literature, and you might say science fiction is a genre of literature, and mystery is a genre of literature, romance is a genre of literature, or jazz is a genre of music, or rock is a genre of music. And so I'm saying that apocalyptic is a particular genre of religious literature, as opposed to, for example, prophetic literature, historical literature that tells sort of historical stories, whether they're actually history or not. That's the way they understand themselves. And so apocalyptic is a kind of writing, a category of kinds of writing. It's also a movement. So we can talk about apocalyptic movements, groups of people who produced apocalyptic writing and who built their organizations and their communities around apocalyptic genres. And so we can talk about apocalyptic groups or apocalyptic movements, and we can talk about apocalyptic writing. And as I say, it stems in the West from, well, really from the 3rd century BC. But within Christianity, of course, in the 1st century and the 2nd century of what you would call AD, or the Common Era. So let's look at the key aspects or elements of apocalyptic genres, of the apocalyptic genre and of apocalyptic movements. They're dualist, so especially morally dualist, right? There's good and there's evil. And early Christian sects, and especially an ancient Jewish sect around the same time as the beginning of Christianity, understood themselves to be preparing for a war between light and dark. And so these images of light, dark, good, evil are typically apocalyptic. And as we said above, the dualism extends to time. And so there are 2 ages. There's a catastrophic intervention that's going to usher in the new age, the just age. The world is understood teleologically, that is to say, with a purpose or a goal. The history has a place that is going to, it's not completely out of control. God is in control of it. Apocalyptic arises in persecuted communities. And so this is not surprising, because it's the persecuted communities that feel the brunt of the injustice and feel the least able to do anything about it themselves. And so the idea that God is going to come in and make the world a better place takes hold in those communities for obvious reasons. And then, of course, the other thing about apocalyptic that we haven't discussed yet, but we're going to, is passive resistance. And so typically, in apocalyptic writing, you are not enjoined to or instructed to fight. You're instructed to resist passively. And it makes sense, because fighting, if you're as oppressed as you are and lacking power, then it's not recommended that you do something that you can't do anyway. And so what you can do is, for example, maintain the faith. That you can do. You can't overthrow the king, but you can refuse to obey the king's orders. You can refuse to worship the king's God. And then we're going to talk about a shift from Jewish apocalyptic to Christian apocalyptic. Just briefly, apocalyptic is very much alive today. It's very much part, in fact, of American politics. And so many American Christians support the state of Israel in large part on the strength of the idea that it's necessary for a Jewish state to be there. And in fact, the temple has to be rebuilt. The Jewish temple has to be rebuilt before Jesus comes back. And so there's a commitment to this understanding of history. But you see it very popular in the 1970s, this guy Hal Lindsey, and he wrote a famous book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which was a sort of modern apocalyptic take on the Bible, biblical, what they would call biblical prophecy. And another book called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. There was a movie based on this book. There's the investment in the state of Israel. And of course, the Soviet Union is understood as the great beast from the book of Revelation, which of course, well, not Satan the beast, but the seven-headed monster and so on. That's all understood to be the Soviet Union, whereas in the book of Revelation, it's the old Roman Empire. But we update these things to today. And then, of course, you may know the Left Behind series of books, which have been very popular, and they're making movies out of them. And the last I knew, there was work on a video game. I don't know if the game is out or not. But it's a real sort of expansion on the biblical text with a whole narrative about the rapture and all of these kinds of things. So, and as you can see, the first book was published in 95, and they're still going. So we're not talking about stuff that is ancient history. It's very much part of culture today. So what about Martin Luther King? And here I'm going to ask you what to think about. What elements seem apocalyptic and what elements seem not apocalyptic? Right? Is it dualist? Is he speaking to a powerless community or a disempowered community? Is he advocating passive resistance? Is he is he Jewish or Christian? So there are a few key points we want to make here. I'm going to go through each one of these with an additional slide just in another few minutes. But I want you to notice several key points to think about for Martin Luther King, and LBJ is just a letter for Birmingham jail. When you're thinking about, especially when you're thinking about how you're going to tie this in with Socrates. So King taps on a long tradition of prophetic descent. What the prophets did was come to the people of Israel. God, in the ancient Israelite community, picked people, prophets, who would then go to the rest of society and deliver a message. And this message was very typically, you're being bad and you need to stop that. He's concerned about justice and injustice. And here, of course, for him, that takes the form especially of thinking about love and hate and violence and nonviolence. And then we're going to talk about time. And you should think about the dualism of time. And then we're going to talk about the nature of human responsibility within the structure of apocalyptic time, and what it is that human beings in a Christian vision, or let's say within King's vision, should be doing. So to look at the first of these, King mentions specifically Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Catholic theologian, and Martin Luther, 16th century Protestant theologian, and indeed for many people we know him as the sort of originator of the Protestant movement in the modern world. But also he's tapping into a kind of universalism, the idea that justice is not just for Catholics or Protestants or Jews or whoever, but for everyone. And here he goes to the 8th century prophets and 8th century BC prophets. And so here think of the biblical books of Amos and Isaiah. It's Amos who uses that great phrase, let justice roll down like waters, right, to wipe everything away, right? And it's Isaiah who says to the people of Israel that God can't stand how their sacrifices smell, their burnt sacrifices, because he's so angry with them about how they treat the poor and the widowed and the orphan. And then he talks about, and of course King's point about these prophets is that they don't just stay at home, they travel. Likewise, St. Paul the Apostle, who writes many of the letters in the New Testament, and his point about Paul is that Paul also confronted people with the morality and to think about their understanding of their relationship to God. And not only that, he didn't stay at home, he traveled widely to do that, as King is doing. And so King understands himself in the tradition of the ancient prophets, understands himself in the tradition of esteemed theologians, and even Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was commissioned by Christ himself in the New Testament. Justice and injustice, and this is absolutely key, right? And you should be able to connect this stuff right to the ways that Socrates talks about these things in Euthyphro, where, remember, he relates justice and holiness, and in the Apology, and especially in the Crito, and his refusal to run away from his punishment, just as King is writing this letter from jail, because he's taking the punishment for having broken the law. And so he says, well, let's think about what's a just law and what's an unjust law. And on 611 and 612, he talks to us about these things. And notice that he's going to say that to be just is to be loving, and to be unjust is to be hateful, to hate people. And so he gives us 4 ways of thinking about distinguishing between a just and an unjust law. So a human law that is in line with the moral law and the law of God is a just law. And then he says, he uses Thomas Aquinas here. He says that Thomas Aquinas talks about this as the natural law is the moral law, and the law of God is the eternal law. And so human law is supposed to be in tune with, that is to say, the social order should be in harmony with the order of nature and the order that God has laid out for eternity. That's justice. And injustice is being out of sync with that, out of harmony with that. So you've got, two of the three notes in your chord are nature and God, and the third one is off, down the scale somewhere and not in with the music that we're playing. That's injustice. Another way he talks about it is as uplifting human personality. So to make human beings, to understand human beings as valuable and as enabling human beings to flourish, to fully realize their humanity. That's what we're talking about with uplifting human personality, to treat it like something valuable and then empower it to become what it fully can be. That's a just law. As opposed to an unjust law which degrades or belittles or grinds into the earth human personality, treats it as nothing. And so here he talks about Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher and theologian, who talks about two kinds of relationships: an I-thou relationship, where you treat the other human being as a person, just like you are, and an I-it relation, where you treat the other people as objects, as things. And so you can see that treating other people as things is degrading human personality. And that's what King is talking about here, that an unjust law treats human beings like things, like objects. And then, of course, he uses the image of sin as separation, right? So sin is separation of human beings from God, but it's also the separation of human beings from each other. And so segregation, he says, is indicative of that. And so segregation in this sense is unjust because it's degrading of human personality. But a unified community is uplifting of human personality. Then he says a law imposed by a majority that applies to the majority as well as the minority, that's a just law. But a law imposed by a majority on a minority that is only binding on the minority but does not apply to the majority is an unjust law. So if I'm the majority and I say you have to do X, minority, but I don't have to, that's unjust. But if I say I'm the majority and I say you minority have to do X and so do I, that's just, right? And again, you can see how this brings in the idea of separation, right? To sort of to make a distinction between the majority and the minority and say that we have different laws apply to us, that's unjust. And then finally, he really says, and he doesn't use this phrase, democratic lawmaking, but it's what he's talking about. He's talking about the ability to vote meaningfully, as opposed to the Jim Crow South, where even when blacks got the right to legally vote, often there were what are called poll taxes, some version of a poll tax, essentially ways of preventing black people from actually voting. And so he says laws imposed on a minority where they didn't even get to talk about, they didn't have a say in what the law was or whether it went into effect. That's not just. Laws where everybody to whom the law applies get to participate in deciding on the law and implementing the law. That's a just way of doing things. So then he's going to take this and that notion of harmony and order as justice should make sense to you from the ways that we're talking about Socrates. So finally, the myth of time, almost finally, the myth of time and wheels of inevitability. And here he talks about this on page 614. And here's where the apocalyptic part really comes in, and this should make sense to you, right? That he says on page 614 that too many Christians are buying into the myth of time and that they have a tragic misconception of time because they feel that change, justice, rolls in on wheels of inevitability. And he says this is nonsense. And so he's going to take the apocalyptic timeline and transform it in a significant way. A way that I think he will argue is very much in line with Paul, and he's going to quote Paul. So if we can look very quickly at apocalyptic timelines, and the first one is a Jewish understanding, and the second one below is a Christian understanding. And so, as we said, there's the dualism, right? There are the two ages, the current unjust age and the future just age. And what does it take? That red line, notice that it goes from right to left. Time heads in one direction towards its goal. So it moves from the unjust toward the just. But what is it that's going to get us there? That red line, that divine intervention, which in the Jewish understanding is the Messiah, the king who leads often an overthrow, leads a war to overthrow foreign oppressors and reestablish the worship of God. Now, the second diagram down there is the Christian transformation of this. And it makes sense because Jesus Christ as a Messiah, leading a war is exactly not the way Jesus' messianic activity is understood. Instead, Jesus comes to earth and teaches, is crucified, comes back from the dead, and goes up to heaven. So somehow the messianic activity has begun when Jesus arrived the first time in his life. Then he goes away and he's going to come back at some future time. And so on the one hand, the unjust age, we're not exactly still in the unjust age because the Messiah has come. But we're not yet in the just age because the Messiah has not come back. And so we have this gap. We have this period where we're living in a transformative time, a changing time, where we're in the process. We're no longer exactly in the unjust age, and we are not yet in the just age. And so what are we supposed to do? One answer is that you wait. That all we have to do, there's nothing we can do at all. And our job is to make more Christians. And if you look at an example like Bob Jones University in South Carolina, what they do is missionary activity. That's what they think the time is for. There are many who believe that there are things you can do that would usher in Christ's return. And so, for example, establishing a Jewish state, getting the temple rebuilt are necessary steps to bring about Christ's return. But basically, you're waiting for Christ to come back. King does something different. He says, we have a responsibility here to be co-workers with God. This is the phrase that he uses. Co-workers with God. And so it's our job as human beings in King's vision to engage in the transformation of the world. Not just leave it to God, but to do the things that we can do to transform the world into a just world. And so his understanding really is that this is part of history. Human activity to transform the world is part of the historical plan. And it's what God intended from the beginning. And so human beings are responsible, right? We don't just wash our hands. Instead, we have to go out and in the world work to transform the world into a just place. Note that on page 316, he refers specifically to Socrates, and this is when he's talking about, protesters getting unruly, and conflict between police and protesters, for example, and the idea that the protesters are bringing it on themselves. And he says, that's like saying that for being out there. He says that's like saying blaming Socrates drinking hemlock on his unswerving commitment to the truth, or Jesus' crucifixion on his unique God consciousness. And these are the phrases that he uses. And so he puts Socrates and Jesus right there together as people who were committed to justice and refused to let it go and were punished for it. And so, of course, there he is then writing from jail. And he's very much putting himself in the company of Socrates and Jesus. And so he understands this responsibility to work for justice, to suffer for justice, but to do so, as he says, in a loving way, not a hating way. because the way you're going to bring in a just age is justly. There is no bringing about a just world unjustly in King's vision. Only justice can bring about the just world. Only loving disagreement can bring about loving agreement in the long run. And human beings have to participate with God and his vision in the remaking of the world into a just world. Thank you for your attention.